nature. Today's topic is Meet the African Elephant, and it's presented by our wonderful expedition leader, Russell Gerber. Russell, thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you, Sunny. And yeah, great pleasure to be back. Lovely to be talking to you all again. And again, another one of my favorites, and we'll be going into a deep dive into the African elephants today. So yeah, thanks so much for joining me, and looking forward to getting into this one. So let's do it. So as you can see, we're going to be going into Meet the African Elephant. I'm coming to you guys live from Cape Town, and this is just a little bit about myself. For those of you who haven't been on one of our webinars before or watched me on one of these, I am a natural habitat expedition leader. I've been one since 2018, but actually been working as a guide and safari guide since 2004. Pretty much all over the world. I've worked as a marine guide as well. I studied marine biology. I have an undergraduate degree in zoology and African vertebrate biology, and then I went on to do my honors degree in marine biology after that. So I always had a passion for the marine side of things, but growing up in South Africa, we spent a lot of time on safari and out in the bush, and that very much, grew this passion of mine for spending time in the wild, and particularly the African wild. So I became a safari guide in 2004. At a wonderful place called Phinda Private Game Reserve here in South Africa, right up in the northeastern part of the country, just on the borders of Mozambique, excuse me. And then, yeah, I've been working pretty much in that field ever since. As I said, a little bit all over the world as a marine guide as well, in places like Dubai, Thailand, the Bahamas. So yeah, I've had quite a lot of traveling under my belt, and worked also as a safari lodge manager in Botswana a few years ago as well. But since then, natural habitat expedition leader, as I mentioned, and also I've been working as a wildlife presenter over the last couple of years while we've been stuck at home, and it's been great fun at africam.com. So just a little bit of background about myself for those of you who haven't met me before, as I mentioned. But onward to today's topic, which of course is the beautiful African elephant. Just to give you a little outline of how we'll be going through everything today, we're going to kick off with just a little bit on the evolution and classification. We're not going to go too deep into that, but just to give you a bit of background on this creature and where he comes from. We'll then go into the distribution, current and past distribution of the two species that we'll be talking about today. A little bit of the description, some facts and information about the elephants that you may not know. We'll go into some life history of the animal as well, going through reproduction, feeding, etc., which should be interesting for some of you. We'll go into some of the threats that elephants face, both in the wild and, of course, more from a human point of view, and we'll be talking about the conservation status and strategies in place for the elephant, and how to alleviate some of the threats that we would have spoken about earlier in the discussion today. So that, as I say, just a little outline of our presentation this evening. And then, of course, some time for questions at the end, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. So please do send anything that you have on your mind about these amazing animals. So here we go. We'll kick off with some of the old stuff and talk about the evolution of this particular animal. They're actually from the order Proboscidae. Proboscidae, you can imagine, coming from that extended trunk or the nose, which of course that proboscis, that's how the name was evolved from Latin. The animal itself evolved to what we know as modern elephants around 35 million years ago. Today, of course, it belongs to the Elephantidae family, which contains all the modern elephant species, and of course the extinct woolly mammoth, which we will not be talking too much about today. A very interesting creature, and I'm sure many of you know a lot about that as well. But again, we'll be focusing on our African relatives this evening. But the scientific name for the elephant itself here in Africa is firstly the savanna elephant, which is Loxodonta africana. And then, of course, Loxodonta cyclona, that's actually cyclone, but it's actually cyclona in the forest area. So that is the forest elephant here in Africa. So we'll be focusing on that savanna and forest elephant as the two actual distinctive species here on the African continent, and a very, very interesting species, of course, to talk about. And one of the things that we really have to dive into is the distribution of these animals. So as you can see in this diagram, this is just the first little map that I wanted to show you of course, Africa. And this is a population estimate from around about the 1800s. And if you have a look, the red color that you see on the map is all the traditional or historical distribution of the savanna elephant. And as you can see, pretty much all over the continent, barring a few small desert areas, very dry desert areas, mind you, and then, of course, avoiding most of the tropical regions, and certainly the tropical rainforest, which is in green. That green portion very much belonged to the forest elephant. And what we've discovered in more recent science is actually that the two species, which were always considered one, actually diverged. And the reason that they've done that, the scientists have done that, is that there really is very little interaction between the species. We see some hybridization between species just on the outskirts of where these two distributions meet. But other than that, we really don't see any other mingling of the genetic diversity between the two species, which is why they've actually decided they are different enough to be segregated into two separate species, which is actually quite interesting in itself. But as you can see, the distribution of elephants across Africa was really, really wide. There pretty much was very few places on the continent where you would not find elephants. And an estimated population of, as you can see there, around 27 million elephants in the two species together across the continent. Now, fast forward a little, and this map is actually for 2012, and things have dropped somewhat since then. But this was the best example that I could show you to compare the two. So if you look at the map today, it's clear as anything that we have lost a massive amount of the individual species across the continent. You can see now the savanna elephant scattered around the southern parts of Africa, East Africa as well, and then very much sub-Saharan Africa. Then you'll also note, of course, the forest elephant still, quite patchy, as is the savanna elephant, broken up populations with very little wildlife corridors between the traditional migratory routes of the various species. And because of that, of course, the protection of these particular species has become quite difficult. But as you can also tell, population has dropped from 27 million in the 1800s to what we think is around about 400,000. It certainly was at this time in 2012. Modern research is telling us that it's probably more closely around 350,000. And that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but the numbers have dropped significantly. And of course, the distribution, where today we find most elephants are pretty much all in protected areas. And here you can see, in that little bit of info at the top there, the number of African forest elephants fell by more than 86% over a period of 31 years, while the population of African savanna elephants decreased by at least 60% over the last 50 years. So they've really had a hard time. And of course, if you think back to times around the 1960s and 70s, the conservation of elephants did actually take a big leap forward when the species was identified as truly being in trouble, mainly from the ivory poaching trade, particularly, which started around the 1800s, really intensified at the turn of the century in the early 1900s, where big game hunting and safari hunting and the ivory trade in Africa just absolutely exploded, and huge numbers of elephants were, wiped off the planet for what was essentially recreational. But then, of course, the ivory trade became exceedingly valuable all over the world, and we'll get into that a little later on today. But as I said, an important thing to note is just to see how much things have decreased in that time period. And I know we are talking over 200 years, but if you, as I said, you look at the little bit of info at the top of the page there, over the last 50 years, we've had an absolutely massive decrease in this particular group of animals on the African continent. But let's learn a little bit more about who this is and what makes them so special. So elephants, of course, many of you will know, are the largest mammals, or largest land mammals, and the largest mammals here in Africa. Obviously, you go into the ocean, we start getting, of course, the big whales and marine mammal species. But in terms of land mammals, the elephant rules supreme. A big male elephant would have a shoulder height of around about 4 meters. If you're looking at that in feet, we're looking at around 12 feet tall, which is pretty impressive. And if you're standing right next to one, you really do feel quite small. The size of these animals is something that often takes people by surprise. I often have people who come with me on safari who just can't believe, when you get that close to an elephant, how different it feels than seeing it on TV. Even if you're in the vehicle, but even more so when you're out on foot and on a walking safari. And even if we're viewing them from some distance away, you feel very, very small. And an animal that weighs up to around 6 tons in the terms of a big male, I mean, is extremely powerful and really does make you feel small, as I mentioned. The total length of the animal is on average around about 8 meters, and that's pretty much from the front of the forehead all the way to basically the start of the tail. And again, so just to give you an idea of how massive the animals are themselves. They live around 60 or 70 years in the wild, so very much a similar sort of age group or age expectancy, life expectancy that you would see as in many people, certainly here in Africa. And so many elephants, if they are protected and in wild areas, you can, as a person living in that area in the wild, see that elephant your whole life. Which of course helps create exceptional bonds and really good relationships within some areas of Africa. But of course, elephants are big animals. They take up a lot of space. They need a lot of territory. And with that, we do get some, animal and human conflict, which again, we'll touch on later in the chat today. But elephants themselves, have a really, really long lifespan. And as many of you would know too, or would have heard, they do have really excellent memories. And how did people know that? Well, mainly from migratory routes. And when things open up between reserves, when occasionally protected areas are actually re-linked and there is a protected area that has now formed a bridge between two older protected areas, often you'll find those elephants will start making their way into those regions along traditional migratory routes well past their lifetime, and that almost evolutionary memory that they have is remarkable. But within their life, in very dry regions, moving long distances too, particularly desert elephants, you'll sometimes see female matriarchs remembering certain locations where they could find water from 30 or 40 years before that. And obviously that's really important in areas in Africa where times are exceedingly dry. And if you get to the water source at the wrong time of year, it can, of course, be catastrophic for your herd. But just amazing, the memory that they have and how long the life actually is of most of these elephants. What is also, of course, interesting is that they have a hugely wide range of habitats, from tropical rainforest that we touched on, all the way through to desert adapted elephants that you see in Namibia, that I've been fortunate enough to see a number of times on safari here in Southern Africa. Again, as I said, adapted to surviving some of the driest and most difficult conditions on Earth, particularly for an animal that needs to eat a huge amount per day, and not to mention is almost requires daily source of water in some cases, with your desert adapted elephants able to go longer periods between actually drinking. So really, really amazing in how much and how wide a range of habitats they do actually live in. And we saw that in the initial distribution of elephants around the 1800s, and how much of Africa they did actually live in. These days, unfortunately, they are mostly confined to protected areas, as I did mention before. mainly because of their size, the nature of the animals themselves, and that they are very protective of their young. They can be difficult for people to live with in certain instances, certainly where there is a larger urbanization of the surrounding towns or villages. It can get very difficult for those two groups of the wild elephants and people to live happily together. But again, stuff that we'll touch on a little later on in our chat today. To dive a little deeper into the various characteristics of elephants, and the first thing that of course I want to touch on, and probably the most important thing when it comes to the long-term survival of these animals is their tusks. And the tusks themselves, as many of you I'm sure do know as well, tusks evolved from teeth initially, and actually gave them an evolutionary advantage to have larger tusks. And the reason for that is that they get utilized for a number of activities. Many people are not sure what those things are, and often you think it's because they simply use them for fighting, but elephants actually use them for a number of things, including feeding. They will use their tusks to actually dig up grass roots and pull them up out of the ground. They'll use their tusks to dig into the side of tree trunks, into the bark layer, where they actually scrape away the bark using their tusk. This is generally in the winter time when things are as dry as they get and there's not a lot of foliage around to eat. They use that tusk to dig into the side of the trunk of the tree, and then to get at what is known as the cambium layer, a nutritious layer which runs pretty much the length of the trunk, providing nutrients up to the leaves, using that tusk, digging it in, using the trunk then to pull it away and actually eating that piece of the cambium layer. And that's just one of the many ways that they utilize their tusks for feeding. You'll sometimes see them actually take a vine or a thicker branch and actually drape it over the tusk and use that tusk to snap the branch and then actually start feeding on it. So a number of uses for feeding in particular. They do, of course, use them for fighting as well, particularly the males, to help protect themselves. And then occasionally those tusks do break when they have those fights. But as I said, a number of uses for the tusks, not just for fighting. Interestingly, they do also, of course, help protect the trunk, just being on either side of the trunk, which is such an important appendage for the elephant. The tusks themselves actually help to protect them. They're very similar in structure to our teeth, mostly made up of dentine, which of course is just a hard, almost bone-like substance on the inside, wrapped in enamel, which is one of the hardest substances in the animal kingdom. And that enamel, of course, helps them to utilize the tusks for feeding and for the various things that I spoke about, even digging into the trunks of trees and helping, to help keep those tusks lasting their entire lifetime, which is, as we spoke about 60 or 70 years, which is a pretty long time for what is essentially one set of incisors. And that's all they are. They're elongated incisors. They pretty much grow for their entire life. They can break, and if the root is not damaged, it will actually continue growing pretty much until they die. So even if it does break off, it will slowly start to come back again. But what is very interesting, and some people may not know, is that elephants, just like people, do have preference for which tusk they will utilize for feeding and other activities more than another. And so therefore can be left or right tusked when you actually look at them. And if you look at this particular elephant, you look just at the base of its tusk there, that it is quite worn away. And almost always when you look at elephants and you have a look in our photographs that we'll be going through today, almost always one of the tusks will be slightly shorter or more damaged than the other, and that will suggest to you that that is, of course, the tusk that they use more often in their daily activities. What is also quite interesting about elephants and has, in very many ways put them on the map when safari hunters first started coming to Africa was, of course, the big tuskers. Now, the big tuskers have become more and more rare over the years with the initiation of huge elephant hunting and of course the massive ivory trade kicking off in the early 1800s, really in strength, but it was even happening long before that, throughout throughout the world, with traders picking up ivory in Africa. So over those many centuries, tuskers just became more and more targeted because, of course, the bigger the tusk, the bigger the reward. And so that particular gene pool just got hit over and over and over in every single location and place that elephants were found across the continent. So these days, very few of those traditional tuskers are actually still around. We still see some around the Kruger National Park, some in an area known as Tembe National Park. Of course, East Africa, we see some tuskers still left there as well. But for the most part, that tends to be the only real bastion of that gene that is still surviving today. And again, when we head out on safari, you really don't see such big tusks anymore. And in many cases, you see that even in some particular groups, particularly I'd say around the Chobe area, many of the females, actually have no tusks at all. They've just, the genes have slowly just made them smaller and smaller, and they just don't have them. Now, we also get asked, does that make life difficult for the elephants? And in many ways, yes, it does. They do have an advantage to having tusks, but of course, elephants are very, very intelligent animals. And of course, they can survive in many different environments, as we spoke about. So they will, live a pretty normal life, but they will have to do it without tusks. And that is very much due to this focused hunting that went on across the continent for centuries. As I mentioned also before, the tusks will continue to grow throughout their lifetime, and if they do break, as I say, they do and will grow back. And that's also why those tusks got so big. If they grew their whole life, they had these genes for these massive tusks, and by the time they got to 60 or 70 years old, in some instances those tusks were even close to touching the ground, which we spoke about already. An elephant at around 4 meters tall, tusks that size were just unbelievably huge. So quite special. But moving on to the next little bit of information around the dental region of elephants is, of course, how do they feed? How do they eat? And one thing that you can see here in this picture is those incredible molars. Now we can just see one set here. Of course, that looks the left top set. And each elephant will have 4 sets of molars, basically one on the top, one on the bottom, on both sides of the jaw. And of course, we'll utilize that for feeding. They essentially grind their food down using those pretty flat molars to grind the food. And what many of you may not know is that they actually only get 6 sets of those molars in their lifetime, each set lasting around about 10 years. So the first set lasts a little shorter, normally about 5 years, and then so you'll have a few after that lasting about 12 years. But essentially, the teeth will last for their life. And once they get to around 60 years old, of course, those teeth are starting to disappear and they have no more left to come through after that. As you see here, each set actually pushes forward and pushes the old set out as they start to wear down. And once they get to around the 60-year-old mark, as I mentioned, they lose the ability to chew. And in most cases, that is, of course, one of the leading causes of death for elephants, is losing that ability to chew. There is, of course, that great myth and story of an elephant graveyard. And many scientists have actually hypothesized that idea behind an elephant graveyard is basically twofold, that the social structure of elephants, they would, if they do lose a member of the herd, they do react in a somewhat anthropomorphic way, similar to how we would, in that they, in a way, it seems as though they're mourning that particular member of the herd. But where the idea of this graveyard came in is that not only would the herd stick around, it was thought that there was often a location with elephants that these particular elephants would go to die. But more likely what's happened is as the elephants get older, they're forced to hang around more permanent water sources where the vegetation is softer, and it's therefore easier for them to chew that food source, rather than moving away into the drier regions where they're often getting sand and grit or even thick wood and bark that will break down those teeth quicker or wear them down quicker. So because of that, often you find elephants, when they get to old age, will spend the majority of their time around permanent water sources. And then with, losing one from the herd, or being often around a water source, it was seen as possibly being a elephant graveyard, but that doesn't seem to be the case at all. Again, just to emphasize the size of these animals, a single molar is actually known to weigh about 5 pounds. I've actually held one. Again, just is crazy, the absolute insane size of the animals themselves. So a single molar around 5 pounds. And we touched on this a little earlier, the amount of food that an animal like this has to go through in its lifetime, eating roughly around 250 kilograms a day, if there is that much food available. But it is a huge amount of food for those animals to get through. And one thing we do have to consider, of course, with all that food going through the mouth and being chewed down, is where does it all go? And if you do ever come on safari, or if you have been on safari, many people always comment to me that there seems to be elephant poop everywhere you look. And that is absolutely true. There's two reasons for it. Of course, one is that it's really big from such a big animal. And because they eat 250 kilograms a day, it does eventually have to come out. But also one of the reasons why it's so prominent in the bush is that they really don't have a great digestive system when it comes to what they're actually eating. They don't have a chambered stomach, and therefore the actual extraction of nutrition out of the food they eat is quite poor, only digesting around 40% of what they eat, so around 60% coming out undigested. And interestingly, in times of the year when things are very dry, actually like now here in Africa, many other animals like baboons and birds, monkeys, will go through elephant dung after it's passed through the elephant and actually eat some of the food that is still left in that dung, as a form of nutrition for them, because often the elephants can get access to foods that the other animals can't, or it's just an easy meal that is easier to find in times of the dry season, when there's just not a lot of food available. So they form such a key role in the environments in which they live, and often considered what we would dub a keystone species in the environments in which they're found. And next, of course, the thing that I think elephants are most famous for is the trunk. And what is the trunk? Well, again, most of us know that it's an elongated nose, and they use it for a number of different things. Smelling is, of course, the most obvious. They do, of course, breathe through the nose as well, and they can breathe through their mouth. They use it for trumpeting, which, of course, is a form of communication and something that many of you have heard in your lifetime. They use it for drinking, but not in the way that many people think. They don't simply suck it up straight through their nose into their throat. They'll actually suck it up into the trunk and then actually blow the water into its mouth, very much as you can see in this shot that I took at Chobe National Park in Botswana. And so that's what they'll do for drinking. They'll suck up the water, put it into their mouth, and then spray it in. They'll also then use that water and spraying it onto their backs and onto their body to help clean them, help to cool them down as well. And of course, the trunk itself, right on the tip, is extremely dexterous and actually can pick things up on its own. It's basically prehensile. And the trunk alone, incredibly, has around 40,000 muscles. So it's a very, very unique appendage. It is exceptionally useful for the elephant in almost every aspect of its life on a daily basis. As I said, extremely dexterous and even prehensile in terms of the tip of the trunk. It actually, can actually close just like that, like closing your thumb and forefingers, and can pick up the smallest things without much challenge at all. And an adult male has actually been known to lift up around 700 pounds with its trunk alone. Now, I've actually seen that happen. I don't know if it was quite 700 pounds, but out on safari when I was first guiding, we came across an elephant in Must, which we will get to in just a little while. And that elephant actually picked up a fallen tree trunk and actually flung it out of its way as it was moving away from us in frustration. I mean, we were a good 100 meters away from that elephant, but they can get quite grumpy when they are in must. And just seeing the power of that bull picking up that trunk and tossing it aside like it was a box of matches is unbelievable. And again, just to emphasize the strength and power and size of the African elephant. As you would suspect, with an appendage that big, they have excellent smell and have more sensory receptors in their nose or nasal cavity than any other mammal on the planet, which again, I think would not surprise most of you. And then we have to look at the ears of the elephants, another very interesting characteristic and an iconic characteristic of the elephant himself. This was a shot I took actually also in Botswana. I can't remember where exactly, but you can see here this young bull scratching his ear. And many people think that the ear canal is actually behind the ears, and it's not. It's actually very much where the tip of that trunk is now. You can see all the hair around the entrance to the ear canal. But the ears themselves, people wonder, well, why are they so big? Well, firstly, of course, it does help them hear really well. They have a much larger surface area. If you're ever sitting at home and you're sitting in the quiet and you're trying to hear something, even just putting your hands up behind your ears like this and pointing it towards the area where you're trying to hear can increase your hearing even just a little bit. And if you amplify that to the size of an elephant's ears, and you can imagine how it would help an animal like this to hear far better than many other animals in the African wild. What is so interesting about elephants, though, is that they frequently use infrasonic sounds which they emit below the human range of hearing. So the sound themselves is almost a low rumble, is what it feels like to us. But of course, it's infrasonic and can travel long distances to other individuals. And in recent studies, the scientists have found that they can in fact recognize particular individuals from other herds, other family herds over a mile away, which is just remarkable and something that I only found out recently as well. Those rumbles themselves can carry some 5 miles in good conditions or in basically the perfect conditions, which allows them to communicate with other members of other herds from that far away. And they'll communicate things like, we're moving or danger, things like that others can pick up on. And this is actually documented by scientists as well. And what is even more interesting, of course, is that more recent studies have shown that the rumbles and those infrasonic sounds are actually picked up through the fatty deposits in their feet themselves. And that initial vibration, they can read what that particular communication is just through the feet themselves, which is, again, just another incredible fact about elephants that I still can't believe every time I hear it. But one of the things that is most important to elephants is that they, of course, are, quite a social animal. And as many of you know, and as we see in many documentaries, of course, they generally live in small family groups. And those family groups are often, and well, as far as I'm concerned, always led by a matriarch. And that matriarch would then have a number of individuals within her herd which are often related cows. So it'll be sometimes her sisters or cousins, females, and then their young, both young males and young females within the herd. And that's often what we would refer to as a breeding herd of elephants. Those family herds are often around about 5 to 10 individuals in one family group, and that would be kind of your focused family group. And then you would have distantly related other herds which form their own family units, which will sometimes come together for a short time to form these mega herds around normally permanent water sources at times of the year when there's just not a lot of water around. So sometimes when you do see a herd of elephants of around 100, you think, well, who on earth is the matriarch? And in that particular instance, it will be a number of different matriarchs, probably at least 10 different matriarchs from each family that will, as they need to, move away from the water hole or that feeding area, and then they would slowly break up into those small family units once again as they leave those areas. The adult bulls themselves actually only join when the female is in estrus or in heat. So his only real purpose to join the herds is to mate with them. And I've actually seen, when the males do come around to mate with females in estrus, it can be a very stressful time for the rest of the herd, as the males can get quite overexcited and can, in some instances, injure young elephants within the herd itself. So it does stress out a number of the other family members within the breeding herds. And often you'll see they try not to hang around these waterholes too often or too long if there are a number of males around that are looking to mate at the time. So that is definitely a time where you see a lot of stress in elephants, is during the breeding season around waterholes, especially in these mega herds with big bulls around. The cows themselves can often mate with several bulls, and this, obviously just helps to alleviate the stress of a number of those males and to make them feel like they've done their job. But of course, it gives the female the best opportunity to mate with the best possible male to carry on their gene pool in the strongest way possible. After around 22 months of a gestation period, pretty long time, a single calf generally of around 100 kilograms is dropped. It can happen pretty much any time of year. We often see a slight peak in births with the oncoming or onset of the rainy season, which down here in southern Africa and most of sub-Saharan Africa is around the December, February time of year. Which is, of course, our summer months. As you go towards the equatorial parts, of course, the rainy season is very much throughout the year, so not too much of a peak in those regions. So they may be born at any time, as I mentioned. Now, the bulls themselves, of course, are the most impressive when it comes to size. But as I say, they spend a lot of time away from the herds themselves, and they form what we call these little bachelor groups. You'll often see a few of the males together at a time, sometimes 3 to 5, 5 to 8, depends on where you are, and they will spend a huge amount of time together. But one thing that really does make things difficult for the males is a period of must. Now, must is a term that was given to them, which is essentially an increased amount of testosterone and other reproductive hormones in their body during this period. And it drives them essentially to want to mate with females. So they'll at that time be looking for females in estrus to mate with. That heightened testosterone can be up to 60 times higher than their normal amounts certainly in the peak of their must period, and that does make them very difficult to be around, I suspect, for a number of their other bachelors. But also when you're viewing them out on safari, the telltale signs of this is the elephants lose the big males in must actually lose a huge amount of liquids, both through the penis itself and actually through glands on the side of their head, that you'll actually see them losing or excreting almost all day, which is a clear sign of stress for an elephant as well. And those things all together just make them quite intense, and they can be quite sensitive to their environment. And often viewing them even in a vehicle when elephants are in must, more often than not, we would actually not view that elephant. We would move off as far as possible just to give him space and time, because they can become quite unpredictable, as you would imagine, with that much testosterone coursing through their body at any given time. And considering that must can last around 2 to 3 months, with basically a peak in the middle of the 3 months. Let's say on average, the first month would be your pre-must, then you've got the highest time of your must period, and then of course your post-must period, where that's just slowly starting to come down and normalize. So 3 months that they can go through this sort of period, but generally only about a month where it's going to be really affecting their mood and behavior. And that normally only comes around once a year. So they can manage it for that time, but it is, as I said, a difficult period for them as well. The bulls will often, you'll see them playing together in these little hierarchical fights. It can sometimes look quite violent simply because of their size, but more often than not, it is simply play fighting. They do it to actually establish some form of hierarchy, but in general, the oldest and the biggest males, hold court, and they are absolutely in charge. And when they do get to times when they are in must and there are females in heat, those biggest, oldest males will be the ones likely to mate with females. And the females in heat will generally ignore the younger males, even if they are sexually mature. As I also mentioned, the males in these little bachelor groups are normally around 5 to 8 individuals. It can vary depending on the environment and how many elephants there are in the area. And often you will find bulls alone as well. So there's no strict rule when it comes to those social structures of the boys. And it can change from region to region, as I mentioned. It just depends on the individuals and how they react to others. So yeah, but more often than not, you'll see a couple of males together at a time. And of course, the threats to elephants. What are the threats? Well, let's go through the wild ones first. And much to people's surprise, you do get some cases of predation of young elephants. Normally up to only around 15 years old or so. Once they get bigger than that, most of the predators in the African wild is simply not powerful enough to take them down, with some exceptions where groups of hyena and lion have actually specialized in hunting fully grown elephants, but we just don't really see that often anymore. But certainly a big clan of hyenas could absolutely take down a young elephant calf if it was abandoned or somehow had lost its family. And in that way, it can be in danger. And often you'll find that if there are hyenas or lions around, that the elephant cows, the females, will be quite agitated when they are around. And even if the lions or hyenas are showing no interest in that herd whatsoever, if they have young calves, more often than not, they will chase those predators away from their immediate vicinity. And it can be quite funny to watch, but very common to see that they simply will not tolerate these predators, even if they're not particularly a threat at that time. They often don't like them around and will chase them at any given opportunity. And unfortunately for the lion, size does matter, and the king of the beasts is the biggest animal in Africa, and without doubt, that is the African elephant. So when push comes to shove, the elephants, they will win. But of course, the biggest threat to elephants, like so many other species on the planet, is, of course, humans. And we certainly need to touch on the trade in ivory and the poaching of elephants across the continent, which has been certainly one of the biggest factors in reducing numbers of elephants across the continent. As I mentioned earlier today, we're focusing our chat on the African elephant species, which is the forest and savanna elephants, and we reckon together at the moment, as I said, conservatively around 350,000 of these animals left in the wild in Africa. The forest elephant, according to the IUCN Red List, is considered to be critically endangered, whereas the savanna elephant has actually been upgraded to endangered a couple of years ago, also by the IUCN Red List. So as you can tell, despite the fact that when you come out on safari, and my entire life going on safari, it would be quite uncommon for us not to see elephant on any given trip. Regardless, they are actually now endangered species across the board, and so are very much in the forefront of everyone's mind when it comes to conservation. Even though at times it feels like they're everywhere, particularly in certain regions here in Southern Africa, where in many instances they've done really well. The Kruger National Park, the Chobe area around Botswana, which I've mentioned earlier, the Okavango Delta, those areas are absolute havens for elephants. Also into Zambia, Zimbabwe, traditionally there were loads of elephants in those areas, and they did do very, very well. East Africa, of course, a big pocket of protected areas for elephants, but especially around the 1970s, there was a huge increase in in ivory trade, illegal ivory trade in East Africa, which annihilated a number of the elephants, particularly in southern Tanzania. In South Africa, that wasn't too much of an issue, and Botswana also quite protected for that time period. But unfortunately, since 2014, we've seen a significant growth in the number of animals poached in this region for what we assume is ivory, or in the ivory trade. So it's been a very difficult time for elephants in the last 10 years or so. And people have become quite concerned with the numbers that we've seen dwindling away in many protected areas, particularly those on the fringe of human settlement. And like so many other species and things we've touched on in the past, when humans and wildlife come into contact together, it can often lead to conflict. And there's been a lot of challenges for that, particularly in poor rural areas across southern Africa, across Africa, in fact, where elephants coming into often subsistence farming areas can clear out a year's crop in one night, and that is a huge problem for families that are dependent on that, not only for potential income, but even just for surviving the year itself. And there are a number of programs in place by government to help alleviate those issues, but for people on the ground, often it's not a realistic solution. But because of those conflicts, we've seen a drop in the number of elephants. We've also seen, of course, a reduction in the number of, or the amount of protected areas, which of course has led to a drop in the number of elephants who require huge areas to survive simply because of the amount of food that they eat. And then also a growing concern, as I've mentioned earlier, is of course poaching and the illegal ivory trade. Also the trade of other parts of elephant too that have become popular over the years. Even things like just these feet, the elephant feet themselves have become quite popular. The tail, things like that, they've actually become fairly popular in certain places around the world, which has led to, of course, a dramatic drop in the numbers of elephants. And so protecting the elephant becomes a really important factor for us. And with around 20,000 poached a year at the moment, it's just not sustainable. We've seen similar sort of numbers in rhino, where their numbers have dwindled significantly, and they've been, I think in many cases far more widely publicized over the last 5 to 10 years, and the plight of elephants has not been considered quite as bad until more recently, where we're starting to see more and more in the news of the current dangers facing elephants and how many are being targeted by poachers in Africa, and that's across the board. We haven't seen it too badly in Botswana and South Africa yet, mostly East Africa and certainly parts of Central Africa. But the problems are absolutely there. So we've seen a huge increase in the support for various anti-poaching units across the continent, from NGOs through to private funding, and of course governments themselves that have put in huge money into protecting their elephant numbers. But again, it's an ongoing problem with the value of ivory ever increasing. These become very well organized syndicates that can get into areas that otherwise were inaccessible a few years ago, simply because of the actual value of the ivory itself, using helicopters, drones, you name it, to get into regions and taking out an individual, getting the ivory and getting out. So those anti-poaching units that are deployed to those areas are critical in helping to protect those elephant species, not just with boots on the ground, but of course technology themselves, and of course even just walking the fence line around reserves and making sure that nobody's coming in and out, and tracking those that are. Those kinds of things can be very effective in protecting elephants, individual species. Human-wildlife conflict solutions, one that we've seen fairly recently, which has been quite interesting, is placing beehives around agricultural areas. There's some evidence to show that elephants are not fond of bees, and that this keeps them away from those crops. And there's been some success with that, and it's kind of an ongoing research project, but it may be a much more effective way than, of course, fencing or, trying to even, physically take out elephants that do walk out of reserves, which is often the case. So that might be a solution, and it may well be an interesting one to keep an eye on in the future. There's also been stories of chilies being planted that the elephants don't like, but I've also heard stories where they ate those chilies like it was nothing. Maybe they really like spicy food, those elephants, but there is some evidence to say that they don't like it. But again, there's a lot of work to do to try and alleviate those problems between the elephants. But if you wanted to see the elephants, where would be the best place to go? Well, of course, if you wanted to see forest elephants, the best place to go is Central Africa. The Congo and Rwanda would be your best spots to view them these days, even parts of Tanzania. And those would certainly be places I would recommend if you wanted to see forest elephants. For the savanna elephants, well, a little bit more of a choice, a little bit more selection, but certainly Botswana. Northern Botswana is probably the best place to see elephants any time of year, particularly the Chobe River and the Okavango, as I mentioned. And then, of course, Kruger National Park, where numbers of elephants are still pretty dominant, particularly in the southern part of the reserve, where you have more of the permanent water sources. So those would be the areas I would suggest to go to see elephants. And in terms of time of year, you can go pretty much any time of year. It all depends on what you feel like in terms of your safari, but their numbers are pretty stable. They don't tend to move too far unless you're going to desert regions, in which case you'd have to look at exactly where you're going. And then, give me a call, give us a call, and we'll be able to direct you on where you'd like to see those desert adapted elephants at certain times of year. But otherwise, in the places that I mentioned, any time of year would be a good time to come on safari to see elephants. And how do you get there? Well, pretty easy, coming into South Africa or through East Africa in Kenya or Tanzania. As I mentioned, through Rwanda, there are direct flights straight from Europe, some that coming straight across from the US into South Africa, I think also East Africa too. So the access is getting better and better, particularly after the last 2 years with of course the pandemic. But we're seeing huge numbers of people coming back, which is so exciting and so important for the conservation of elephants. And yeah, I'm looking forward to and hoping very much to see some of you out on safari next year. But I think I'm running out of time, so that will be pretty much it for today. So thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, if you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you so much. Before we start the Q&A, I want to remind everyone that they can submit their questions via the questions field in the control panel. But we already have a ton of wonderful questions, so I'm going to try to get through a bunch before our time is out. I want to start with one about losing tusks. Have you observed the evolution of entire herds of tuskless elephants as a reaction to their ancestors being killed for their tusks?
Yes, yeah. So as I mentioned, for me, the area that I noticed it most was northern Botswana, along the Chobe River. A number of herds, full herds of mostly females, had no tusks. A few of the young males had small tusks coming through, but in terms of the females in that particular group, a great number of them, they actually are tuskless. And even those that aren't in that region, we're seeing that the tusks that are coming through are quite narrow or thin and even brittle in some cases, that a lot of their tusks are actually broken as well. So certainly in that particular region, and we're not entirely sure why. There's a few different hypotheses of why that in that particular region it's so severe, but as of yet, there's no clear answer as to why. But yes, I have actually seen an entire herd of just the females that didn't have that were tuskless completely. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, I'm going to combine a few questions about the men or the males in the herd recognizing their offspring. Do they recognize their
Mhm.
offspring if the females are mating with several different males? And how is inbreeding avoided in future generations if that's the case?
A great question. They don't, to be honest. There is often inbreeding in the wild in Africa. You know, from elephants to lions, leopard. It is actually quite common. And again, it sort of highlights the importance of these. You know, the migratory routes, the huge territories that are often required by these species that were cut off. You know, traditionally. Simply because of urbanization, of the growth of various agricultural fields. It did cut them off, and in many cases that has happened. But these species can tolerate a certain level of inbreeding. Um, they say normally around 3 or 4 generations they can handle before you start seeing any real defects. It does, of course, weaken the population in many ways, but for the most part, we don't see any major effects for 3 generations, they say. But again, you have to consider also the size of some of these protected areas, even though they're nowhere near what they once were. Don't ever forget that Kruger National Park itself is larger than the whole country of Israel. And even though it's a fenced-in area, some of those elephants will move long distances and never see their family ever again. But in terms of recognition, I don't think so. It's unlikely that they would recognize uh, a, a, offspring, but certainly the matriarch would recognize certain males, and that she would unlikely mate with the same male twice. It does happen from time to time, but again, with their memory, they can keep them off. But elephants, the males themselves, they won't really know who their offspring is.
Got it. Okay, so another combination of questions. Is there
Mhm.
commingling of forest and savanna elephants? And why is there such a difference in declining populations between forest and savanna elephants?
Yeah, another great question. So there is we're seeing what they're calling some hybridization between the savanna and the forest elephants, just on the edges of those populations. That if you remember that distribution map, so basically just along the edges of those populations, some hybridization, but other than that, it's pretty clearly distinct, the two species. You just don't see the savanna species living in those forested regions, and vice versa. You don't see the forested species living outside of the forest. So that was, in many ways enough for the scientists to differentiate between the two and actually declare that they're separate species. Um, but why the forest elephant has been hit so hard, why we think that their numbers are so much less, is very much, I would say, most people would argue the main reason behind it is the political unrest in those areas for long periods of time. And those civil wars drove the trade in ivory, often even something as simple as providing meat for people to eat, um, drove what we think the mass culling of a huge number of elephants in the forested and tropical regions of Africa. And that, I think, in my opinion, would be the biggest reason that their numbers have been hit so much harder than the savanna elephant.
Got it. Got it. I think we have time for one more question if we can sneak one in. Are there any efforts underway to reconnect disrupted migratory trails so the gene pool can be enhanced?
Yes, absolutely. There is great work being done. WWF themselves have put in a lot of work into creating various projects where these migratory corridors can be reformed. But even just the amount of work being done between countries, a good example would be between South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique, with the creation of a trans-frontier park between the three countries, essentially dropping the fences of Kruger with Zimbabwe and Mozambique, to allow the elephants to start moving into those regions and increasing the area of the park significantly. What was funny about that, though, is that they actually tried to force the issue by moving elephants from South Africa and the Kruger Park across to Mozambique to to get them to start utilizing that region more. And they found that within about 6 months to a year, those elephants came right back to South Africa. And then it actually took a couple of years for them to start going on their own across to Mozambique, where now they actually are moving across in good numbers. So it's just a matter of time and effort, which is so difficult to get together. But there are amazing people and conservation groups that have been doing incredible work for quite a long time now. And so I'm hopeful. There are a number of good stories and positive stories about elephant conservation. And as I mentioned, Kruger and East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, and Botswana are fantastic positive stories in terms of elephant numbers and their populations in many areas actually growing. But they have got their own difficulties when it comes to human-wildlife conflict. But again, these are things that we can manage with some positive thinking and people working towards the same goal. So even though there are issues, there are a lot of positives coming out about elephant conservation, and if they keep that up, hopefully we'll be able to see them for many more generations.
Excellent. Well, I apologize to our listeners that that's the last question we have time for. You all presented me with so many wonderful questions. So we'll have to do this again, Russell.
No problem. I love elephants. Even though I've been terrified by elephants many times on foot, as in my career as a guide, and even in a vehicle, they are just one of my favorite animals to watch. I can watch them all day. So
I totally agree. So I'll turn it over to you for any closing comments.
Thank you. Yeah, just again, thank you everyone for watching. And as I said, a great pleasure to chat about elephants to all of you. As I mentioned, I have a lot of positivity around the conservation of the animals and of elephants in particular. And I think that people are really just enthralled by them as a species, and with that kind of attention, they tend to provide a lot of protection for a number of species underneath them. So again, we refer to them as a keystone species, but often also considered an umbrella species, because if we protect them, it protects a number of other, maybe less recognizable species below. So yeah, coming out to see them on safari, for many people, a big favorite. It helps to conserve entire regions, if we keep the elephants around. So hopefully we'll get some of you to come out and come and visit us, and we can talk about this in person. So thank you very much, everyone.
Well, thank you again, Russell. That was fascinating, and we will definitely have to do it again. We're going to hold you to that. And I want to thank everyone else who tuned in today. Please join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Hope you all have a wonderful day.